Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third in a series of what we call the Keep Your Business Moving bite-sized webinars brought to you by Merchants Fleet, the nation's fastest growing fleet management company, serving those companies that leverage vehicles to do their jobs and get goods and services to their clients, something that is essential at this time. We hope that everyone on this webinar is safe and well, and our thoughts go out to those who have been impacted by this pandemic. We know it hasn't been easy, and we are all working through it together. My name is Amanda Rogers, and I serve as the Vice President of Marketing and Innovation here at Merchants. I will be today's moderator as we discuss how to keep company data secure as more people are working remotely. We will keep the conversation fluid, so if you think of questions along the way, please don't hesitate to send them in the chat, and we will address them at the end. I'm joined today by three of the Merchants Fleet technology team who are actively involved in executing these strategies with their teams daily. And since these are bite-sized webinars, each of our panelists have been asked to bring a snack with them that has kept them moving during this time. And today with me, I have fresh blueberries. With that, I'd first like to introduce Janine Charlton, Senior Vice President and Chief Technology and Digital Officer here at Merchants. Hi, Janine.
Hi, Amanda. Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me. So today I have this delicious double chocolate peanut butter protein bar. Chocolate and peanut butter are two of my favorite things.
Me too. Great choice. All right, next to Janine, we have Jason Jones, Director, Data Analytics and Information Architecture here at Merchants. Good to see you, Jason.
Yep. Hi. Thanks, guys. Today I have my Belvita Bites. Classic.
Oh, nice. Classic. Thanks, Jason. And finally, joining us today is Marcin Grechik, Director, Infrastructure and Security. Hi there, Marcin.
Hey, Amanda. Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to have some fresh strawberries.
All right. Excellent. Today's topic is data security. So Janine, can you just give us a little background on what it is and why you think it's important at this time, given the remote environment that we're in?
Sure. Let's start by talking about what data security means. It's really about protecting the digital data from destructive forces and the unwanted actions of unauthorized users, such as a cybersecurity attack or a data breach. Today, more people are now working remote. And according to the cloud security firm Netskope, 6 out of 10 American knowledge workers were working remotely as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic as of March 19. And they projected that that number was only going to continue to go up. Currently, more than twice as many people are working remote in North America compared to last year, says Netskope's threat research director. And even though there was a spike after COVID, remote work increasing has been an ongoing trend. A special analysis was done by FlexJobs and Global Workforce Analytics, and they found that there's been a major upward trend with the amount of people working remote in the United States. In the span of just 1 year, from 2016 to 17, remote work grew 7.9%. Over the last 5 years, it grew 44%. Over the previous 10 years, it grew a whopping 91%. It is possible that these numbers will remain elevated even from where they were previously as companies reopen and the pandemic subsides. It's important to refine and establish these policies now and on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, Janine, you mentioned how quickly remote work was trending upward even pre these times, and now I think we're seeing that companies are starting to see how it can really be a general mode of operation for them, and it can work. So given that, and that we might see this become more and more of a trend, when it comes to data security, what do you think is important for them to start thinking about now?
Well, today we'd like to focus on these 6 particular areas. And let's start by talking about making security everybody's responsibility. You are the first line of defense, so take it seriously and always be on guard. In the end, it will save you and your organization time, money, and your reputation. Next, think about implementing tools and protocols. there are several tools and policies that can be implemented to support employees and help provide the first line of defense. A few examples of this would be things like access protection, data protection, and remote work protection. Be sure to develop your training plans. Start by reviewing your current plan. Next, evaluate the resources that you need to support your plan. Do you consider outsourcing, partnering, or should you build your own training program? And finally, make sure to consider the culture of your organization as you're building your plan. Next, make sure to develop your continuity plans, both your business continuity plan as well as your disaster recovery plan. It's important to remember that they serve very different purposes and need to be treated differently when developing your plans. Let's talk about knowing the data regulations. There's so much to know, and the landscape in this space is rapidly evolving. Data privacy rules are becoming today's reality. Take, for example, 3 measures currently being considered around federal privacy legislation: the COVID-19 Consumer Data Protection Act, the Consumer Online Privacy Act, and the third, the Consumer Data Privacy Act. And I guarantee you there is more of this coming. And finally, be on the watch for vehicle IoT trends. It's important to understand that the data exists in your organization, and really, where is it going? Really be mindful of the amount of data being captured to better understand vehicle utilization, as you will quickly be getting into what we call the big data world.
Yeah, Jeannie, I think we could spend hours on any of those topics, and one that really struck me was this concept of making security everyone's responsibility. And I think we'll highlight each of them, and I'd like to start with you on this one. Can you help us to understand how everyone plays a role in data security across an organization?
Sure. Let's, state the obvious here, right? Technology component of data security is something that every organization needs to consider, and we'll talk about that later. But the truth is that everybody has a responsibility to ensure that the data and the information is secure. Remember, if you see something, then say something. It's more important now than it ever was. Many employees are working remote for the first time, so encourage everyone to reach out to their peers. You can't walk over to their desk currently because we're all, for the most part, working remote. So if you see something that doesn't look right, pick up the phone and have a conversation. Make sure that you establish and communicate remote work policies, including personal device use. And remind your employees of the responsibility to manage both their equipment and their company's data. Also, make sure that you have leadership buy-in and alignment. It's really important that the message of security responsibilities is enforced by all leadership levels, and it's not delivered only by the technology team. If the leadership team isn't aligned, you will have an uphill battle that you're faced with. Lastly, communicate with employees about phishing campaigns. Make sure you're staying ahead of this. Really build a communication mechanism that will allow both proactive and reactive messaging. There will always be situations where a phishing campaign could get through, and you will have to take quick action. It helps if you have an established communication channels that employees are both familiar with and certainly that they trust.
Thanks, Janine. Great points. And what I'd like to do now is get into a little bit more of the detail behind some of the planning and the tools and the protocols that you can implement out in your organization. So I think we'll kick it over to you next, Marcin. And can you help us understand what some of the key components of security that a company needs to make sure that they have implemented? I know we have a ton here, so maybe you could just highlight a few for us that will help us in terms of developing our own tools and protocols.
Sure. Thanks, Amanda. So there are multiple lines of defense when it comes to the data security. But today, let's just focus on a couple of them. So for example, first line of defense is security controls, right? So from the data protection perspective, you might want to look at the role-based access and authorization and authentication protocols, right? So It's essential to grant access to the database and the roles and responsibilities to minimize the exposure. Another thing is it's a good thing to follow best practice on the password protection. So one of the latest recommendations from the NIST Institute is to use memorized secrets. So what does it mean? That means that employees can use phrases instead of single words for their passwords. Phrases are naturally longer, and they also provide some of the components of passwords that are normally required, like uppercase, lowercase characters, and the special characters or numbers. So they're also much easier for employees to memorize and use. Another component of authentication that it's always good to use is a single sign-on and a multi-factor authentication. So use both of these anytime you can, because they provide an additional layer of protection. What's important is also encryption. You want to make sure that the data is protected in transit and at rest. So make sure you use encryption. Some of the things that come to mind when talking about this are SSL or SFTP protocols, and also encrypting using a native encryption on devices and laptops to protect data at rest. One of the access protection examples are secure VPNs. So as Jenny mentioned, we see a significant increase in use of VPNs as the world switched to remote work. It's critical to use VPNs to connect to the company resources, especially from external networks. So as for merchants, we've seen over 300% increase on the VPN usage since we switched to the remote work. Second line of defense is detection. So here we're going to be talking about border and endpoint protection. So as far as border protection, your firewalls are really the first devices that protect your company from external attacks. So make sure that you limit number of administrators on these devices to a minimum. You want to make sure that these devices are always up to date. And also, it's important for you to understand what devices you have. So next generation firewalls can provide additional threat protections like URL filtering, content filtering, or geo restrictions. In some cases, also some threat detection and prevention options. So make sure you understand your devices so you can maximize their effectiveness for the organization. As far as endpoint protection, make sure you deploy antivirus and threat protection on all your endpoint devices. It's very important, especially when these devices are often offsite and outside of your local networks. The other thing is you want to make sure that devices are encrypted in case they're lost or stolen. So that's another important component. As for the third line of defense, it's employees. So switching to a remote workforce is a cultural change, and it requires change management like any other change. So it's important that your company update the policies to incorporate new rules and processes. And it's also important for employees to acknowledge these new policies. Clear communication is a key, and it's very important for your technology team to be vigilant in providing support for users, as well as making sure that the new policies are being followed. That might include additional monitoring and, in some cases, even baseline validations.
Yeah, Marcin, I think on that point too, having great training so that the third line of defense, your employees understand what they need to do in order to protect data. So can you talk to us a little bit about developing that training plan?
Sure. So one of the key elements is in protecting data is employee training, right? As companies are developing their plans, they want to ask themselves couple questions, right? So first of all, do you already have a plan? So chances are that you have components or or security training already in place, right? So you don't want to start from scratch if you don't have to. Another question is, what resources do you have? So you want to determine the best approach, if you want to outsource, partner with someone, or build it yourself. Do you have existing training system that could be leveraged, right? That could help you develop some of these training plans or the content by yourself. Don't rely on the technology team to provide security training. There might be other groups in your organization that could be able to help. So definitely look for partners inside and outside organizations when looking at the training. As for merchants, we partner with HR. That works great for us because we are able to leverage existing training mechanisms that are familiar to users. So that makes things much easier for employees. Another question is, what's your security culture, right? So you're going to have to look at what's the optimal frequency of the training. Is it a monthly? Is it quarterly? What's appropriate for your organization? Also, you want to look at is it the first time you're going to be issuing the training? The first time content might be different than your recurring content, right? And what's most important is really don't forget about onboarding. Training your new employees is as important as training your existing workforce. So as for merchants, we chose to issue quarterly training, and we just issued our QI material that incorporates topics like encryption, remote work, and phishing threats. And you also want to look at your business and roles of your users. For example, a fleet maintenance representative that deals with some driver information might benefit from additional training on personal information versus salesperson that conducts the business using his cell phone might benefit from additional mobile device training, right? And really everyone can benefit from basics like phishing, impersonation, or ransomware type of attacks training. So
yeah, Marcin, I know for me, I've used a lot of the trainings in working with personal devices as well. So password training that we've done, that's been extremely helpful. So thank you so much, Marcin. And we're going to kick it over to Janine to talk a little bit about developing your continuity plan. So with those processes in mind, Janine, when you're thinking about a business continuity plan or a disaster recovery plan, what do you think is important for businesses to better plan and prepare for future scenarios with those?
Sure, thanks, Amanda. I would suggest starting with the creation of your business continuity plan, right? The BCP is very strategic, and its goal is to figure out the steps needed to keep your business running. I recommend having the plan personalized. There is no way that a cookie cutter plan will give you the insights needed to develop an effective plan for your business needs. The development of a robust continuity plan is essential for all activities across your organization. And I think too often companies limit executive level participation to approval and to funding roles. But I believe that the COVID pandemic has certainly changed that, as all functions of an organization became immediately involved in building out and executing the transition to remote work. When you build out your plan, make sure to build your plan for different situations. How will you continue to operate your business? Make sure that the plan has clear ownership assigned and adjust for the new risks in the new world. And this pandemic certainly has brought that to light. And finally, I suggest testing on a periodic basis. When it comes to your disaster recovery plan, its goal is to really ensure that your business becomes operational as quickly as possible following a disaster. The basic things that a DRP is responsible for is ensuring that the infrastructure is operational. This may require alternative locations, recovery of lost data via backup retrieval, ensuring connectivity to things like phone, internet, and other functions. Is your hardware and software operational? When you build your plan for disaster scenarios, make sure that you're addressing how to keep your technology as well as your data running, and most importantly, secure. And finally, make sure that you're testing on a periodic basis. I suggest reviewing your plan on a quarterly basis and then formally testing via a tabletop exercise on an annual basis. This is truly considered a best practice.
Great, thanks, Janine. All important aspects of building a plan and developing your tools and having your training. And now I'd like to also talk a little bit more about data privacy and how companies store and handle data. It's something that is being increasingly scrutinized. So Jason, I'll kick this one over to you. What do you think is important about data privacy? And what do you think are some important questions that companies should be asking themselves to manage it?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Hi, folks. I think in this around data privacy, there's four big really questions that you need to start thinking about, right? One is, why should we care, and why should we care now, right? Do we have a sense of what the regulations are going to look like? And the probably answer to that is yes, right? What type of data do we have that could potentially fall into a personally identifiable framework? And then how do you manage that? So if we start with the first one, I think as Janine alluded to even in the upfront, organizations cannot take a passive approach to data privacy in the future if they want to stay compliant to regulations. A national data policy will almost certainly become a reality in the US, and it's probably going to follow similar approaches to the EU's GDPR. Brazil has one that's going to go into effect in August of this year, I believe, called the General Data Protection Law. Even California, the California CCPA policy went into effect in January of this year. Now, compliance violations in almost all these policies are not slap on the wrist type of violations. They're really fines, right? In the GDPR case, it can be up to 4% of global revenue. And even in the California policy, it can be, I think, upwards of $7,500 per day per violation. And you can see that can escalate to a pretty large cost if you're in a data breach situation where you have hundreds or thousands of records that have escaped your ecosystem. So around how do you just start to think about regulations? Like, how do you know what the regulations are going to be? I think that the takeaway today is that, most companies in the US will not be 100% compliable right now with CCPA. However, the goal should be to start making progress towards a mature compliance posture. An important first step of that is to identify someone in your organization is accountable for really understanding your exposure and for developing your data privacy strategy. An example in the GDPR case is they actually require what's called a data privacy officer. That's a central individual that's there to handle consumer and regulatory requests. The third question we want to highlight here is, what type of data do you have? Really answering what type of personally identifiable information a company collected may have been pretty straightforward a decade ago. We think of things like name, social security number, physical address. Those would have all been easy forms of PII. However, it's important to understand that the scope of personal information collected today is much more complex because we gather large volumes of transactional and behavioral data that can be combined via big data platforms to actually identify individuals or households, which would fall then into the PII category. And then how do you manage it? I would say first, let's just take a deep breath and remember that compliance is a journey, as we said earlier. Don't let the scale really paralyze you. Start with some basic data mapping exercises that highlight data domains, not individual fields, that need more detailed cataloging to understand if they contain personal information. I like to think of it like more of a process of elimination here. From that point, as Marcin alluded to, start to look at the data access policies you have around role-based and even row-based security for those data domains that have not been eliminated in your mapping exercise. And finally, the last thing to start thinking about then is your long-term data architecture approaches to align to compliance requirements.
Wow, Jason, lots to think about there. Thank you for that perspective. And I think what I'd like to do now is just continue the conversation with you, Jason, and really thinking about the future of the vehicle Internet of Things trend. And you mentioned PII, and increasingly the vehicle is capturing that type of information or the potential of that type of information. So what do you think are some important considerations for companies to be thinking about when it comes to the connected vehicle and data security as you're seeing it now?
Right. Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, I know it may be interesting to bring this topic up during data privacy, but there's really three reasons why I wanted to address this today. One is that telematics and IoT generation, data generation is not new, but really technology advancements around big data, around streaming data, around analytical modeling, they're all moving from the fringe to really take center stage, I think, in the fleet management space. We're just capturing a lot more behavioral and location data from vehicles than we ever did before. Before we may have thought of things like statuses and things of that nature, but now we're getting into, speeding, braking, accelerating, all these other kind of behavioral aspects of of what's happening with the car itself. And we know the last thing is we know that, from the COVID experience, it's really going to change the long-term, home delivery ecosystem. We know that probably online commerce will never really return to pre-COVID levels. It's always going to be something higher. So in that vein, I really wanted to focus on three themes. The data that's captured in a vehicle, what the purpose of capturing it, and then the last one is really around turning things on and off, right? Turning data on and off. Again, when we think about the first theme, it may seem very simple, like, well, if I capture driver data, I know that's probably it may end up, we don't know yet, but it may end up being in the PII space. But if I don't, well, we also have to start thinking about, are there ways to combine what we just talked about, behavior data, location data, and say even like a fuel transaction data? Can you combine that and triangulate it to start to build profiles of individual drivers, as an example? If so, then you have to think that might need to be part of your data privacy strategy. I think in the middle concept, here we want to move beyond just what data you collect to really the purpose. And this was a big theme in the GDPR, is that you needed to define the purpose of the PII data in order to be able to excuse me, I lost my train of thought. In order to be able to identify and really be transparent around why you're collecting that data. I know for me personally, in an analytics world, I just like to collect all the information I can collect, and then I'll figure out what to do with it later. In our case, in the vehicle case, just because the vehicle can produce it may not mean we want to collect it and store it. But if we do, we need to be proactive and ask ourselves why we're collecting it and document the purpose in our data privacy. I think the last thing to really touch on is having a sound policy for turning data on and off, right? We need to be transparent and document consent policies for when we're going to turn data, especially IoT data, on. And then if an asset leaves our portfolio, we need to have really strong governance process around turning that data off and either archiving it or actually removing it from our ecosystem.
Great, thank you, Jason. So tons of great information, from thinking about data security from a strategic perspective and how that's important in the remote working environment, some tools and protocols that we can implement in our companies now, whether you're just ripe into a remote working environment or you've been in one for a while. And then looking at data privacy and the future of the connected vehicle, and why considering your data privacy strategy is so important from a regulation standpoint, and then from the types of information that you are gathering. And so given all that great conversation we just had, we are out of time, so we won't be able to get to the questions that we have in our queue today, but we will certainly follow up on those. If you have additional questions, feel free to submit them to our panelists. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you, panelists, for this great discussion. As a reminder, we will be sharing webinars like these weekly. And next week, we have a special webinar on May 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We will be hosting an hour-long webinar via Automotive Fleet about strategies for a post-pandemic market. To register for that webinar, please visit automotive-fleet.com/webinars. Our next Merchants Bite-Size webinar, like this one, will be on Tuesday, May 26th, again at noon Eastern. And in this webinar, we will be hosting a roundtable with our partners and suppliers from across the industry for the latest best practices for fleets should be implementing as they either continue to adapt or get back on the road. We have quite a broad spectrum of partners that will be working with us on that, so please tune in. And for a sign-up link to this webinar, as well as recordings from our past webinars, please go to merchantsfleet.com/keep moving. If you need to reach someone from the merchants team, we have our contact information here as well. And again, thank you for your time today. Stay healthy, stay safe, and know that Merchants is here for you to keep you moving.